Garret, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Trey.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Look, it's always a lot of fun getting to talk with somebody who has created something that is so enjoyable, but it's even more enjoyable for me when I've got a little bit of a personal stake in this, and as was the case with Woodstock 99 when you and I spoke a few years ago about that one. You and I go way back to actually spending some time at the University of Texas together, running the same circles, hanging out from time to time, maybe drinking a little bit too much at time, but here we are all these years later. And man, you have really made a name for yourself as a documentary filmmaker. First off, kudos on this beautiful project. I had a chance to watch Yacht Rock through Max last night, and man, it does not disappoint. So congratulations.
Thanks, Trey. It's funny. I think our lifestyle was much more Woodstock '99 back then, and now we've both kind of graduated to the yacht rock lifestyle, I imagine, these days. So it's great to talk to you and see you again, my friend.
That's right. So this obviously predates both you and I, just in terms of when this music was initially popular back in the late '70s into the early to mid 1980s. So how did you end up attached to this project, Garret?
Well, it's fun. We brought up Woodstock '99. That was the last film I did with HBO, and they had reached out to see if I wanted to pitch another music doc with Bill Simmons, who helped produce this. And I was like, if I was going to do another one, it needed to be much lighter, first off, than the Woodstock one. And I wanted one that really celebrates the music itself, and showcases the music. I had no idea what I was going to do. At the time, I was working on a TV series called Daisy Jones and the Six, which was it took place in 1970s Los Angeles, but it romanticized this kind of the Fleetwood Mac, type of bands and the Eagles and like the Laurel Canyon scene. Yet I found it so interesting. This whole other group of musicians were like working day and night in music studios at that time. So I was kind of obsessed with the music studio side of it. And then coincidentally, I met the daughter of Christopher Cross through a friend, and her best friend is Michael McDonald's daughter. And we were at a bar drinking one night, and they were like, why don't you do a documentary about our dads and this word yacht rock that has come to define their music 25, 30 years after the fact? I was like, that's interesting, but from their point of view. And that was kind of the genesis of it all. So I pitched it. Bill Simmons loves yacht rock, so he was immediately on board, and HBO was like, yeah, let's do it. So that was kind of the beginning of it.
Bill, and I guess I knew that you were coming out with this documentary based on us having a conversation with our friend Gabe a few months back. But Bill Simmons has been pushing this documentary heavily on his podcast, and I listen to his podcast regularly. He is obviously a big fan of the final product as well. What is it like working with him? I'm not sure how involved he is as an executive producer and some of the day-to-day, week-to-week stuff, but what is it like being a part of something with someone who has obviously created so much great documentary-style work over time?
Well, he's a filmmaker first, kind of producer. He kind of lets me make what I want to make, and we talk creative and talk notes. But he really does give you the keys to the kingdom when it comes to making these things. He wants a director's point of view on this. So, I'm forever grateful for that, because I've worked on other projects where there's a lot of hand holding and too many cooks in the kitchen. But he does bring a ton to it, and the most important thing is he loves documentaries and these stories, and he loves music. So, he's always been super supportive in doing that.
Are you utilizing Bill Simmons' name? And I ask this as somebody who does a lot of my own guest booking, and I've received a lot of praise from people over time for the caliber of guests that I'm able to get. Are you utilizing his name as you're setting up some of the big name people that you had take part in this documentary? People like Thundercat, obviously, Fred Armisen, and plenty of others who end up participating, although there were a few who declined with some not so kind words in the process. I won't spoil that one for anybody who still hasn't seen it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of he encourages us to that, and HBO too. I think you bring names like that. I think potential subjects see there's a level of prestige or quality, I guess, associated with both those names, which helps because doing these projects, it's all about access to the people. That's the hardest part. You can pitch a million of these stories, but like unless the people that are in the room are involved and kind of giving me these interviews that are like unguarded and authentic, then you don't really have anything. And so you do as a filmmaker whatever it takes to get that subject in a room, and if it does a little name dropping, that helps. Absolutely.
So I guess it's important that we define what exactly yacht rock is, because I'm going to be honest, I had a different definition of yacht rock versus what this documentary spells out. So for you, as somebody who has probably had to give this definition a few times over the last few weeks in promoting this film, what exactly is yacht rock?
Right. So it's very important to know a couple things. First of all, it was not called Yacht Rock in the 70s. It was, that name came from a web series in the early 2000s that just stuck. It was a comedy, low budget series that these guys were kind of, making up these like alt history stories of these soft rock musicians hanging out, making cool, smooth music together. So that's where the name came from. They kind of created this monster that has come to define, this music. But, I kind of took their definition, and I think because they are the OGs, and it makes sense once you start really breaking down what they kind of determine what is yacht rock and what is not. Most yacht rock is soft rock, but not all soft rock is yacht rock. That's very important. It was this jazz R&B infused music being made in Southern California in the mid to late 70s and early 80s with these world-class session players playing all these albums. And if you take those rules, it starts to kick out a lot of people, I think, that people just kind of feel is synonymous with the word yacht rock. Your Fleetwood Macs and your Eagles and your Air Supplies and your Jimmy Buffetts, your Hall & Oates, that's an East Coast band. So I think a lot of people always consider those bands as yacht rock, either because they sing about being on a beach like Jimmy Buffett, or, they have that kind of, that soul sound like Hall & Oates. But it's really like Los Angeles plays a character in the sound of yacht rock. And that's really important to get across.
Yeah, so LA-based musicians. The Hall & Oates thing surprised me, but as you said, and as mentioned in this film, those guys are Philadelphia-based. So even though they do have some of the pop and R&B sensibilities, they weren't a part of that group of LA musicians who was making a very similar style of music, even if some of their music is reflected, I guess, in that overall sound.
Absolutely. I implore everyone, go back and watch the Yacht Rock comedy series. It's still on YouTube. And like Hall & Oates are the villains in that series. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of uncanny, the connections they made back then in the early days of the internet when Wikipedia really wasn't a thing. And these stories, they're kind of true in some cases, just kind of exaggerated, I guess. And like it's a lot of fun when you see what they created and what really happened at the time from the artist's point of view that we talk about in the film.
So considering that Michael McDonald and Christopher Cross's daughters helped talk you into doing this, was the starting point in terms of gathering information talking to those two guys? Because they are heavy participants throughout this film, and they do a phenomenal job as well. I love the insight that they provided.
No, I think my first interview was that two-person interview with the two of them sitting down with me. Yeah. And I had no idea. I was like, is there a story here enough to kind of, can I tell a full film here? I knew there's a rise, a fall, and kind of a comeback story, which I love, but like still, are these guys good on camera? You don't see a lot about them, Again, they've always been kind of passed over that era of making music, or kind of mocked about or joked about. So I sat down, I saw the dynamic of the two of them talking to each other and talking about this time and how much fun they had talking about making music in the late 70s. And that's what was like, okay, I can do this. There's a story here. And once I had the two of them involved, everyone started kind of rolling in. There's a snowball effect. I got Kenny Loggins. I got all the Toto guys. And then the modern contemporary musicians came right afterwards because they love this music so much. I got Questlove and Thundercat and Mac DeMarco. So it was kind of easy to get people once the two of them were involved.
Yeah, I didn't realize just how much yacht rock influenced Thundercat, for instance. And obviously Questlove has a variety of musical influence as well. But to see the amount of love and the impact that yacht rock had on Thundercat, to the degree that I had completely forgotten about this, that he had Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins. They had a collaborative effort several years ago, and I'm assuming they still revisit that from time to time. Was a really cool aspect of all of this.
Absolutely. Like it's so endearing, right? Their passion for these artists. And I think it brings another level of legitimacy talking about them when you have these well-known, contemporary musicians talking about their influence on their own music.
Just how big was Steely Dan and yacht rock really getting going back in the mid to late 1970s?
It's the big bang of yacht rock, as we kind of make a case for. I mean, it really, the sound they were doing, this kind of jazz-infused pop music, and so many of kind of the Mount Rushmore players of yacht rock started their careers with Steely Dan. Michael McDonald was a background singer with Steely Dan, David Page and Jeff Porcaro were part of Steely Dan, played with them on many albums. So I think you see that, and you see how we make a case for like this kind of family tree of artists, because there's very few people really in LA making this sound, and they took the influence of Steely Dan into their own work and kind of spread like wildfire from there and changed the landscape of pop music from like the early 70s of LA, which is much more kind of folkier, Laurel Canyon, 3-string guitar, to this, jazz-infused pop music that dominated the radio and Billboard charts and Grammys as the late 70s and early 80s came.
So Michael McDonald goes from background singer for Steely Dan, and he eventually does a lot on his own and with others, and that includes Kenny Loggins. I mean, they make some absolute bangers that are not only songs that are still widely beloved today, but they were literally winning Grammy Awards. I mean, everything from What a Fool Believes to Heart to This Is It. But you do kind of ask this question, and I don't really remember them answering whether or not they got together more, but they really didn't get together more than a handful of songs back in the early 1980s. Did they ever discuss with you why they did not work more together at that time?
I just think, they both had these successful careers. Michael was playing with the Doobies and doing his solo thing. Kenny was successful, and then he started transitioning to all the soundtrack work, and his sound even started to transition, found like this new kind of, space for him to work in. But you think of these duos like, McCartney and Lennon, all these people, it's like, God, if they spent more time together and wrote more songs together, what would we have? And I think you can say the same about Kenny Loggins and Michael McDonald. There's, I think Questlove says in the doc, there's a synergy there that's so, prevalent in the work they created.
I knew very little about Christopher Cross before watching this documentary, but he is not only very talented, he seems like a very sweet person as well. And I love his story about how he came up with the lyrics for "Ride Like the Wind." How did he come up with those lyrics with the state of Texas actually serving in the background?
Yeah, he was on acid driving from Houston to Austin on acid, and the lyrics just spilled out.
That song takes on a completely different meaning when you realize that he was on a hardcore psychedelic like that to come up with those seemingly innocent lyrics. But the lyrics aren't even that innocent when you listen to them.
Right? I cannot express how grateful I am for like the honesty and the openness of these artists talking about how these songs were made. And I think that's what makes this film so unique, because you haven't heard these stories. And it's like it's the opposite of what the caricature of this musician you think of, and Christopher's an Austin guy, which is great. So go Austin. But yeah, again, I am just so grateful for these guys, trusting me and, handling their stories. And, again, they were so excited to talk about this time. And I think a lot of people have kind of abandoned this music over the years or skipped over this time period. And I'm hoping we kind of bring it back.
Yeah, I mentioned Loggins and McDonald's three biggest hits. That includes What a Fool Believes. Why do a lot of people consider that a sort of turning point musically for yacht rock, Garrett?
I keep bringing back the guys that created the term, who are like probably the biggest yacht rock scholars we have now too. So, and they made that comedy series not as a joke, but like out of the love of this music. There's a reverence there, and I think that's really endearing too. But they have this thing called the Yachtski scale, where they rate all yacht rock songs, and What a Fool Believes rates a 100. So all of yacht rock is measured off that. I think it has all the elements. It has Michael McDonald. It has Kenny Loggins. It's got this, this sound that's been coined the doobie bounce that Michael McDonald played, on the Fender Rhodes piano, that so many songs have basically emulated after that. So I think we make a case for, how inspirational that sound and that song is for the music that came after it. So I think those elements, help kind of pave the way for this sound, I guess. And, those elements were found off Steely Dan. So you really do see this, like, kind of, these lines and these connections being made of this music.
Yeah, the doobie balance. You guys did a great job of taking little 2 to 3 second snippets of all these songs coming out that time that were basically just a play off of What a Fool Believes and using the doobie balance to show that, and look, this is the case in all of art, that there was a lot of copycatting going on in an effort to capitalize on a sound that people obviously loved back then.
Yeah, and it crossed genres too. Like country was using that sound, and R&B and soul. So you really do see the influence of that.
Well, it's also cool to see that, look, Yacht Rock really fizzles out in the mid 1980s, 1985, if you really want to pinpoint a year, but gets a sort of resurgence in the late 80s and early 1990s through hip hop. I had never put those two things together, but I thought that was another fascinating element to all of this through De La Soul, Warren G with Regulator, and a lot of songs like that back then.
It was really important to kind of showcase not just for me, but the artists themselves, the importance of black music on their own music. I think a lot of people kind of categorize yacht rock as like kind of white yuppie music. And that's kind of why I think all the artists were allergic to it when the first names started coming around, because that was everything against their influences were, and they wore those influences on their sleeve, so to speak. And we talk about, how important R&B and soul and gospel and jazz were to these musicians that kind of took those elements and brought it into their own music. And I think it's really interesting how it kind of comes full circle that hip-hop artists were the first to kind of bring it back into the fold, because these records were in their parents' record collections or played on black radio stations when radio was much more segregated in the late 70s, early 80s. So I think that was an important thing I wanted to get across in the film. I'm glad, you're picking up on it, because I think it's, it was important for me. It was important for the artists themselves to tell that story.
Well, it's also interesting to see that MTV actually played a hand in the death of Yacht Rock. Of course, before it was ever called Yacht Rock, but the popularity of that music style went away as a result of there being more of an emphasis on the visualization of this music that people loved at that time, too.
Absolutely. Music became much more multidimensional, in the 80s when you had the music video. It's not just how well you sound or how good of a song it was. It's also how you looked. So you have artists like, Madonna and Prince and Michael Jackson who start to kind of push, these artists out, in this kind of MTV-centric space that we were kind of moving into. So, listen, I needed a bad guy in this movie. And, the 80s, MTV, that's my antagonist. So, you need something to push against this time period. And it makes sense in the end when you look back and kind of step back and see how this music was. It was so popular in the late 70s and early 80s. And yet it kind of just fell off a cliff as the mid 80s came. And, music started to change also, where you have like the British invasion and sounds like that and, coming in. So, again, I needed a bad guy. The 80s are always the bad guy in my stories, it feels like. And, it worked.
There's another, I wouldn't call it a bad guy necessarily, but another polarizing element to Yacht Rock. It's the most polarizing song that I think exists in terms of popular Yacht Rock. That would be Toto's Africa.
Yeah.
Why is that song so polarizing for people? Because look, it's a very catchy tune. It's obviously Toto's only number one hit, and a song that they're still capitalizing on all these years later.
I think listen, the lyrics are a bit ridiculous when you kind of break them down. And they're the first to joke about it, right? Which I think is so much fun. But you can't deny its popularity and its longevity. And then we talk about you feel like you're so tired of the song, and then that chorus kicks in. You're like, this is a banger. I cannot turn this off. It'll always be there for me. So I don't know. It's their number one hit they ever had. And listen, this film for me is my official campaign to get Toto inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because that group of musicians are so prolific. I think people don't understand, where they belong in music history, and they definitely deserve their place because they've played on over thousands of songs, as session players. And then they were basically the backing band for Thriller, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, they were responsible for a lot of music that many people like myself may not realize until watching this documentary. And it's also a cool side note for the band that they started as a high school band, and then all these years later they reform while still having day jobs as session musicians, and they clearly make a name for themselves as the band Toto as well.
Absolutely. They were all best friends in high school,
Yeah.
and all they wanted to do was get back together and play together again. So it's again, I just love this comeback element to this story, whether it's the overall story, but even in the story of Toto, they get back together, they had the success. And, I think it was interesting last week, Trey, I got to screen the movie for all the artists for the first time. None of them had seen the film. And I was terrified, it's like, oh my gosh, because, these people trust you to tell their stories, and they have no idea what's going to happen. And it was beautiful. They were hugging. They were so happy. I think, again, they see the respect that they haven't gotten, I think, or rightfully deserved over the years. So it was pretty magical. And I also had the guys that created the comedy series there too,
Oh,
and
cool.
none of them I've ever met before. So that's really interesting because they've all kind of changed each other's lives,
Yeah.
for the better, I think. So everyone's friends now, everyone's getting along, and everyone's just happy this music's back in the world.
It is so fascinating that those comedy guys have become scholars for
Right?
this genre of music, and it's a genre that they're responsible for labeling, of course. I wonder how much of this knowledge they possessed when they were coming out with this web series. Clearly, they had an admiration for the musical style, but for them to be spouting off like really interesting information, not just being funny jackasses in the process, let's say, was another fascinating turn here.
They just like they read liner notes and records and just started like literally drawing the lines between all of this. And again, I brought up earlier, it's so uncanny, the relationships and the backstories they were able to kind of emulate in the comedy series because talking to these artists like that's kind of similar to how it really happened. Besides all the joking and the captain's hats on.
So yeah, so I take it Donald Fagen from Steely Dan did not take part in the artist viewing of this documentary.
Definitely not. But hey, listen. So the Steely Dan story, I make this whole movie, and these movies are only as good as having the music in the movie and listening to the music, especially when you're talking about a sound that's very particular, like yacht rock. So I had like 6 Steely Dan music syncs in this, and everyone has signed off on their music set for Steely Dan. And I'm just like, I don't know how to do this without their music. And the film sat idle for a couple months, waiting for Donald Fagen to sign off on it. And finally, we get a phone call from Irving Azoff, kind of his notorious manager, who's been managing them since the 70s. He's like, I love the film. Not sure Donald's ever going to sign off on it, but I'll see if I can get him to give you a call, Garrett. I'm like, okay. Weeks go by. I'm answering every single phone call, every unknown call, or every telemarketer call, hoping Donald Fagen calls. Sure enough, like a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, Donald calls. I'm shaking, right? Like, oh my God, he's actually called. I'm like, can I record this, Donald? He's like, sure. I hang up on him on accident, Trey. I'm like,
Oh,
oh my God, with no callback number. I'm like, I freaking ruined this. What am I going to do? Luckily, he calls back. He goes, you have one more shot at this, kid. I just put on speakerphone, record on my computer, and the conversation that happens in the movie
yeah,
happens
don't spoil it. Don't spoil it.
happens in real time. And afterwards, Azoff calls back. Donald says, use that in the movie. The music's all yours. So I think it's a wink. You'll see what happens. But I got all his music in the film because of that. And, I'm excited for people, it's a lot of people's favorite part of the film, I think.
I'm reluctant to ask this question because I don't want to spoil that because it is truly just the cherry on top of this beautiful project here. But why do you think he responded the way that he did, Garrett?
I think he has a persona he likes to keep up.
Okay.
As I've learned making this, Steely Dan fans are fanatics and are very polarizing. Most of them hate the word yacht rock. They think it's a dig at this music that means so much to them. A lot respect and understand the reverence behind it. And I've gotten love emails, I've gotten hate emails from Steely Dan fans, but I think Donald thinks it's funny overall the label. But
So he's maybe leaning into a character a little bit too.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, again, I don't think I would have gotten his music if it's not like we're a documentary. We're not paying a lot for syncs in this thing. So he's not getting rich off me licensing his music. I can tell you that. So I think it's a wink. You know what I mean? He gets it. What's so special about this is with all the artists and their kind of relationship with the word yacht rock, they can't deny that it's brought a whole new legion of fans to their music, which they love. They love that new generations are discovering this. Like we say in the film, Michael McDonald, he's like, I thought my career was over in the 80s. I thought it was done. And, I always ask them all, I go, can you talk about touring in the 70s and now touring in your 70s? Because they're all still making music. And that's pretty special.
I assume that whether you're talking about Michael McDonald or Christopher Cross or maybe the Toto guys, you got backstage passes for the rest of your life whenever they're performing around you.
I hope so. I haven't cashed in on that. I definitely can go to Yachtly Crew and Yacht Rock review shows. I know that. So I got to start somewhere. Those guys have become friends too. So, and then, they're carrying the torch on too of this music. I'm just so happy that, new people are discovering this or people are rediscovering this music that might have abandoned it years ago. I always talk about this music being the soundtrack of our lives. whether we liked it or not, because it was always in supermarkets or pharmacies or doctor's offices. And I think people have taken it for granted a little bit because it's always been there. But once you kind of dig in and kind of approach it non-ironically because of the name, it's hard not to fall in love with it.
Well, for those of us in our mid-40s, there's also a chance that our parents were actually procreating us to this music too.
Yeah, we're Generation Yacht Rock, not Xers, right?
That's right. So just a couple more questions now. First off, and I don't think this was the case for Woodstock 99, but viewers of the Yacht Rock documentary are graced with your beautiful mug at the very beginning of this film. How did that decision go? Because I know that's not always the case that a documentary filmmaker puts themselves in the film, but clearly it was important for you to ask those questions at the very beginning.
That's a Bill Simmons thing. If you go back and watch all the 30 for 30s, it's always a director's introduction, and he's carried this over on the Music Box series. Listen, I'm much more comfortable being behind the camera, but I think Bill's credit, I think he likes to give directors a face, and this is, I guess you can call it, this is my work. So I guess it's nice to put a face to the work sometimes. But yeah, definitely not my idea to put myself in my own movie. I promise.
Okay. All right. Last two questions now. First off, what do you love about Yacht Rock?
I love what happened to me while making this. I kind of entered this ironically also, because I knew of the series, I knew the name, and I knew about kind of these guys have all been kind of a pop culture punchline over the years. But again, once I started kind of get to know the guys and hear their stories and really see the artistry and the musicianship behind the music, I've fallen in love with it and become a bit obsessed with it. My family's so tired of the Yacht Rock, so tired, because I've been living it for the last 2 years. But I think it's everlasting. It's transgenerational, this music, and I think it always will be.
And final question now, Garret. What do you love about filmmaking?
Doing interviews with Trey Elling after I have not seen him for years. No, I love telling stories that affect people, good or bad. I don't care. As long as I'm affecting you, I'm doing something, and that's, I'd rather that than people just like, oh, that was okay, and move on, especially now when everything's so disposable. So if I can make anything that affects anybody, for a moment, I feel like I'm winning. So that's what I love about it, Trey.
He is Garret Price, a Texas boy, University of Texas grad, and a world-class filmmaker whose latest is so good. It is available on Max now. It is Yacht Rock, a documentary. Emphasis on the DOCK there with the Yacht Rock, and he's been nice enough to join me for a few minutes to talk about that. Garret, thank you so much for the time today. It's always a pleasure catching up with you, man, and best of luck with things in the future. Hopefully we'll get to talk about the next project down the road.
Thanks, Trey. Go Horns.